Thank you for taking the time today to join our session on what's possible, understanding how the Internet of Things can drive business growth. My name is Benjamin Dohler. I am a Salesforce consultant with LedgeView Partners. Now this is an unbiased session, so it doesn't matter if you have Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or any other CRM for that matter. We're just going to be taking an overview on the Internet of Things and how that applies to your business and also to a CRM system. But first, we want to break things down. So let's start off with looking at exactly what is the Internet of Things. What do we mean by that? Well, the Internet's been around for quite a while. So the Internet was worldwide adopted in the early 1980s. And yes, there are plenty of us who are older than the Internet, me included. Now, looking back at how the Internet has transitioned over the course of time, back then, the Internet could have been defined as the Internet of people. And that's because the Internet was designed by people and for people. There were things that were involved with social aspects, music. You could look up any piece of information you wanted to on the Internet when Wikipedia was evolved. The Internet had started taking on the form of commerce with eBay and Amazon. And of course, we have all had more than our fair share of cat pictures. Now, it still does all that. That hasn't changed. But around 2008, the Internet started to evolve. Devices began overtaking people in the amount of data that was being exchanged on the Internet. This wasn't something imaginary. This wasn't something out of the Jetsons. This was becoming a reality even in 2008. This was the transition from the Internet of people to the Internet of Things. So you might say, well, what exactly do we mean by that? What do we mean when we say the Internet of Things? Well, the Internet of Things is a networking of physical devices embedded with sensors, software, and network connectivity that allows those devices to collect, interpret, and exchange data, both with themselves and each other, along with people. Now, when we talk about a thing, that can be almost anything. That can be an inanimate object. That could be a machine, a building, vehicles, people wearing devices like smartwatches or carrying their phones. It can be things as simple as floor mats. Anything that has a sensor can be labeled as one of these things in the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things then brings the physical and virtual worlds together as one. So you might be wondering, well, what is it that makes a thing a thing? That's actually pretty easy to define. There's 4 core components that are involved in one of these things. First piece is hardware. So that allows a physical item to speak digitally. These are typically sensors. And the interesting thing about hardware is the cost of hardware. So back in 2007, a single axis accelerometer, just tracked motion in one direction, had a cost of $7. Today, you can pick up a 6-axis accelerometer. It tracks motion 6 different ways. That only costs 50 cents. So the cost on the hardware components, when we talk about sensors, has come down dramatically over the last 10 years, which has made the Internet of Things more popular from a manufacturing standpoint. The second layer to this is data. So this is the piece that everyone wants to protect because everyone else is after it. Think about it from a business standpoint. This is the thing that you will rely on. This is what the Internet of Things is made of. The amount of data that gets generated then allows you to make business decisions, whether that be looking at trends or whether that be reporting. This is the piece that is one of the largest components within this model, and it's the piece that everyone else wants to get their hands on, which is why privacy comes into play. So we can't have a discussion on the Internet of Things without discussing privacy, because that is a huge concern when we start talking about devices talking to one another. And we'll dive into that here in a little bit. The third layer to this model is software. This arguably is the second most important layer in this entire thing. And that's because software takes that data that the hardware is generating, those sensors, and is turning it into something valuable and meaningful to you or to other machines. And lastly, we have connectivity. Connectivity is the most important piece when we talk about things on the Internet of Things, and that's because without this piece, you just have a standalone device. And there are plenty of those. There's lots of machines that have hardware, data, and software that generate and do certain things in manufacturing facilities or healthcare or in retail industries. but with the connectivity that allows them to connect to a network and then speak to other machines or speak to people and broadcast their data to let other things know what's been going on and what state they're in. That's what completes this model to make this a thing. Now, before we go any further, we should probably take a little trip down memory lane as to how this all sort of evolved. So the term Internet of Things was coined by Kevin Ashton back in 1999. Now, that was some time ago, 18 years ago, and we've come a long way since then. Now, Kevin was a co-founder at Auto ID Center at MIT, and they created the standard for RFID technology, radio frequency ID. Now, and back then, as he started to be more involved with this, he sort of saw that there was going to be this mass change in how things were communicating, not just broadcasting information, but using that information to help other things, other devices, other people make decisions. So that was 18 years ago, and there was a lot of things that were going on back then, even though it may not seem that long ago. Back in '98, Google was incorporated. So if we think about, the search engine that everyone seems to use, that people use now as a verb, that happened in '98. So we can see just how far back we've gone. In '99, the Dow had closed for the first time above 10,000 points, even though now we've crossed the 20,000 threshold. And of course, who could forget Y2K? When everything was going to crash, servers were going to stop functioning, stock markets were going to tank. Everything was just going to stop functioning, all because of a 2-digit year instead of a 4-digit year, except it didn't. So why now? If this all happened back then, we look at Kevin Ashton coining the term in '99, there was this transition of where things were producing more data than people on the internet in 2008. Why is there this sense of urgency? Why is it that now we're starting to talk about the Internet of Things? That is due to business and consumer awareness. So what you're looking at here is a Google Trend chart, and you can go to Google Trends and run this chart on your own by putting in Internet of Things as your term for what's been searched for. What this chart represents is the amount of searching, the amount of interest that there has been in the term Internet of Things over the course of time. Now this chart only goes back to 2004, that's as far back as they were tracking data from a trending standpoint. And you can see that even as we get in towards, as we pass 2008, when the Internet of Things actually started to evolve, and we get into 2011 and 12, even then there wasn't that much interest. Until we start to get into 13, 14, 15, 16, that's when this chart really starts to pick up, where there's more and more people and businesses starting to look into this. What is this? What does this mean? What can I do to be prepared for this? Now, the most interesting thing about this chart is its peak. The peak of this chart happened in October 2016, just over 6 months ago. So even though Kevin Ashton coined this term and realized this was going to become something back in 1999, and the transition actually started to occur in 2008, it wasn't until October of 2016 that people finally started to take notice. So you might be saying, big deal. Well, the history lesson was great, but what's in it for me? Why should I care about the Internet of Things? Well, when it comes to the Internet of Things, there is a lot of money at stake. There are lots of numbers all over the board on this, depending on whether you're looking at revenue opportunity, whether you're looking at economic impact, but there seems to be a very large consensus that it doesn't matter which statistic you're looking at, there is a lot of money involved with the Internet of Things, both from the opportunity side and the manufacturing side, the production of these sensors. So when we look just at the revenue opportunity, they're predicting that by 2020, there's going to be $4 trillion of revenue opportunity for businesses to be had from the Internet of Things. $4 trillion. And we're talking about the amount of devices that are being connected to the Internet currently. As in this 2017, there's approximately 15 billion devices that are already connected, and we'll get into what those are. You might think that they're smartphones and watches, but it actually turns out they're not. The majority of these are in businesses and manufacturing facilities, healthcare, retail. They're stating that by, the predictions are that by 2020, that number is going to increase to 40 or 50 billion devices. That many different devices, not including sensors. When we talk about sensors, each one of these devices has 4 or 5 sensors on it. We're looking at 200 billion different sensors producing data. That's a massive amount of data. Now, if you're looking at the economic impact involved around this, again, the numbers are spread out, but the consensus is it's a lot. 10 to 14 trillion different, $10 to 14 trillion involved in economic impact for businesses and for the world. So if you're not looking at it from a monetary standpoint, maybe there's not, you don't see a benefit in the monetary stance. Maybe you're looking at it more from a predictive maintenance side, or maybe you're looking at it for a reporting side. There are lots of other benefits to IoT than just money. There's options for increasing efficiencies within your organization. The data that gets generated on patterns and trends allow you to fine-tune processes, whether that be through machines or actual business processes. When you look at managing resources, if you're getting fed real-time data from devices, you can have immediate alerts. You can be notifying the right people the first time versus running through a chain of someone getting notified, which has to contact another person, which contacts another person before an issue gets resolved. So being able to manage that resource load and making sure the correct person's there the first time. The ability to then improve safety as well. This comes back to performance trends. So looking at your data trends that are coming off of certain devices or certain machines, that can be used to find issues early, address them early, prevent what would otherwise be a potential failure, which then could have an injury to an individual that might be nearby. Reducing costs. So we look at, again, we looked at predictive maintenance. This could happen as well based off of trends. So when we start plotting trends of how machines are operating or how things are supposed to be performing, as soon as that starts to deviate outside of the range of what's normal, we can start looking at, should this operation be stopped? Should this machine be brought down? Should something be changed before something else fails so that we can keep our uptime high? Looking at like a manufacturing facility, thinking about a conveyor line or thinking about a large piece of equipment, as soon as you know that there's potentially something getting out of range, whether that be a heat sensor, whether that be a oil sensor, whether that be a pressure sensor, if any of those start to fall outside the range, you can bring that machine down and prevent any large maintenance happening by taking care of a small issue right away instead of waiting until something were to break. And then lastly, even a marketing advantage. So when we look at IoT, the data that you're able to produce and potentially provide to your end customers, whether that be a business customer or a consumer, can provide a lot more value than a competitor's product. So let's take a look at this from use cases regarding IoT in today's world. Now there are a lot of different areas, many different industries. Almost every single industry has a benefit and already has a use case for IoT. This spans everywhere throughout the globe, from buses and automobiles to charging stations, buildings, factories, even livestock. There are companies that have IoT devices that are able to read cattle, not just read cattle, but able to take readings from those cattle for health readings to find out, are they healthy? Is there anything that's low? How are they on milk production when we look at cows? Almost every industry has an advantage or has a capability of using IoT. What we're going to do is just touch on a few of those. So we've grabbed just a few of them. I want to start with construction and just look at a few use case examples for where this would apply in a construction industry. We're going to look at sensors, RFID sensors for tracking building parts and components to find out where they're located, where they are they at the right location? Are they heading out to the right truck to go to the right job site? Sensors in the actual equipment. Think of those big heavy machines, whether they be bulldozers or cranes, looking at those and tracking analytics on them to find out, are there scenarios where we need to be bringing those machines down for maintenance before we get to a scenario where something were to break, where we be off the site for a day, where someone could potentially get hurt because of a serious issue with a piece of equipment. We look at the small pieces of equipment. We start looking at tools, whether they be generators or machines or small pneumatic tools. Knowing where those are, having small sensors on those that show where they're located. So you know if there's one that needs to be in a certain location at a certain time, it can be there. And then once we get all the way to the end product, we can look at green buildings, the end of the construction cycle, where imagine a building that can detect whether or not there are people inside of it on certain days or on weekends. So it knows all these systems don't need to be on anymore. Sure, we've got some programmable thermostats and we've got other components for lighting, but what if we get all the way into the details? Like, I know there's nobody here on the weekend. There's no reason to have the water on anymore. Let's shut the entire water system down except for sprinklers, and to save water from that leaky toilet that might be going. Or if it comes to there's a holiday and the system's not programmed for that. It's programmed for 5 days a week, and Saturday and Sunday it's programmed for heat and lights off. Well, what happens when a holiday falls on a Monday or a Friday, or even in the middle of a week? If those sensors detect that there's nobody in that building and it's firing those systems up, it can decide not to bring those systems up and then cut costs on electricity and heating and cooling. Then we get into manufacturing. There's actually a lot of applications when it comes to manufacturing. When we talk about IoT, one of the benefits of IoT is remote operation. So not only can we be pulling information off of sensors, we can be using that data to then remotely control those machines as well. And in manufacturing, there's huge advantages to be able to do remote operation, whether it be just because there's a scenario where a person's not needed there, or whether it's a too hazardous of an area for an individual to be working in safely. That gets us into improving workplace safety, both from a hazardous situation, or we get back to that predictive maintenance. If we've got individuals working on machines and we're able to determine that there's a potential failure with that machine about to occur, we can cease operation on it and get that person out of there and have the machine down and repaired before there could be a catastrophic failure that could inevitably hurt that individual. Coming back to the tools piece, manufacturing facilities. There's a lot of manufacturing facilities that are moving into a lean manufacturing. When it comes into lean manufacturing, even lean just doesn't come from the production of components, but the tools that are tracked with it. So there may only be one or two of a specific item that are in certain areas within that facility. Knowing where those items are at all time helps keep track of them so that you don't have extended expenses trying to purchase new tools and new items. And then lastly in here, predictive maintenance. I sort of touched on that already, making sure that you're able to reduce downtime by keeping track of the trending of what's a normal operation and then being able to predict what's going to happen with that machine so that you can safely bring it down and spend less time in down and more time up producing products. The third one we're going to get into here is healthcare, and there's a large area in healthcare where this IoT has an advantage. When we start talking about healthcare in general, patient surveillance, think about hospitals and rooms, how devices hooked up to that individual are broadcasting information to a nurse's station or to a doctor. We start getting into more advanced things like smart pills and monitoring patches that are attached to an individual to help monitor their well-being or help monitor their abilities. We get into preventative care and rewarding customers for wearing specific devices. I know there's hospitals or insurance companies that sometimes will have walking bracelets like Fitbits or something that will then track individuals' progress, and as they promote being more healthy, they use that to their advantage to reward those customers with either gift cards or discounts or whatever the case may be. And then when we look at monitoring systems that save lives, they have pacemakers that broadcast data back to a doctor. So you could be at home with a pacemaker and it will send that information to a device that's hooked up to your network and broadcast that information out to a doctor. That way, if something happens to you, that doctor knows immediately what's been going on so that when you go in or you call that nurse with an issue or you go in for that visit, they already have a printout of everything that's been going on, how many times that pacemaker's sped your heart up, how many times it's had to slow it down, how many times it's had to activate, so they can keep track of that information rather than trying to rely on you knowing exactly when those events had occurred. So I've been mentioning these three areas, construction and manufacturing and healthcare, and there's a reason I was focusing on those. And it's when we start looking at where these devices are held. Now I mentioned before that today there's over 15 billion devices in place, and there's predictions of hitting 40 to 50 billion by 2020. And you might initially think, well, that's because we all have smartwatches, we all have smartphones, there's thousands, there's millions of those out there. And yes, that's true. But the majority of devices, when we start talking about IoT, don't reside within those consumer spaces. They reside within business applications. When we look at those 15 billion devices and break it down, over 40% of those are actually contained within business and manufacturing facilities. because they're tracking real-time analytics. They're looking at supply chains, the equipment. They're looking at robotics. So it's all contained within that manufacturing facility. And following that up, we have healthcare with all the things that we were just talking about, followed by retail. Now, when we get in the retail space, there's even smaller sensors. There's little Bluetooth beacons that are used in the retail space so that when you walk up to a display and start picking up and moving it around, that Bluetooth sensor is transmitting data on how long it's been picked up, how many times it's been turned over in hands, how long it's been looked at before it's set back down. And they use that information then to translate that back to a sales to figure out how well is that display working? Are having these things in this location working or not? Are we selling more product to end consumers by where it's located? Also in the retail space, they have floor mats. There are floor mats that have sensors in them so that when you walk up to something and stand there, it tracks where you're standing, how often you're standing, how many times you're shuffling your feet, where the patterns are for where people are moving. Also, they can then find a better way to sell product to end consumers and figure out what works the best on sales. And then beyond that, we also get into security and transportation, where we start looking at biometrics and facial recognition. Are we looking at vehicles with GPS and performance tracking within vehicles so that they know if a vehicle needs to be tuned up before even an end consumer would? So as we've been talking about all this, we've been talking about the tracking of all this data. And as we're talking about the tracking of data, there's one piece that comes into play that we haven't discussed yet, and that's security of this data. Not just security regarding securing the data for your business, but also for the public. And that's where we start to get into privacy. So privacy is a huge concern, and you cannot have a discussion revolving around the Internet of Things without bringing up security and privacy. So the privacy of this data is extremely important, both from a consumer standpoint and from your business. Because when we start talking about machines talking to machines, we get into a very gray area. Now we're talking about programmatics and how to determine what's sensitive and what's not. When you and I talk, or when you talk to another business or to a customer, you know what's sensitive and what's not, what should be said and what shouldn't. But when a machine's doing that, it's just reporting data. So how does it know what's sensitive and what isn't? So that becomes a concern. How do you tell the machine this is information that should be transmitted and this is information that should not? Also, as you're looking at that, is the right data being captured? Is there too much data that's being spewed from a sensor? When we start looking at data, there's an overwhelming amount of data that can be transmitted off of a sensor. Some of these can report multiple times per second. And we start looking at that, we start wondering, well, is that too much data? Because realistically, if you're not going to be able to act on the data and use it, you're only putting yourself at risk by capturing too much data. And then lastly, as we start looking at this data, who is this going to be shared with? Is this going to be shared with anyone else, any other businesses, any other departments, any other divisions within your company? Where is this data going to live and who's going to have access to it? Because as that data gets stored and has to be maintained somewhere, there become entry points for hackers or people who shouldn't be allowed to see data, whether that be your own employees or other consumers, and you don't want that information to escape. There's a saying in the security world that says security professionals have to get it right every time, but a hacker has to be right only once. And that's also true when it comes to the Internet of Things. You have to make sure that the data you're generating isn't sensitive and that no one else has access to it except the parties that are involved. So if that didn't just completely scare you off, if you didn't stop the video right there and are still with me, then there's only one final question left as we continue through this journey. And that is, do you think you're ready to join the Internet of Things? If you think you might be, there's a few pointers that we have for you. And that is, number one, it's all about the data. If you're starting to look at a strategy for your business around the Internet of Things and what you can do to capture data using sensors, keep in mind that the data you're going to be capturing should be driving the strategy. You need to start with a business need. Why should we do this? What advantage would this play, either for us as a business or for the end user, whether that be another business or a consumer? And then it gets filtered down to the products. What do we have where these sensors that would be transmitting data, whether that be a data that's being streamed for analytical purposes or sensors that are trying to track whether or not something's in a failure state, where do these things fit where it would provide the most benefit? And keep in mind that the data that's being generated, this needs to be focused on and used as a real-time feed to help really hone your decisions within your business and to help the end users as well. The data itself that gets generated needs to be actionable. So you might think, all right, well, how does that actually tie back to a CRM system like Dynamics or like Salesforce? And it comes back to that last statement, actionable data. You can't act on the data properly if you don't have the full picture, and that's what a CRM system does. So whether you have a CRM system or whether you're looking for a CRM system, CRMs in general allow you to capture and see a 360-degree view of your customer. Think about the products that they purchased, maybe even initially taking a step back when that customer first contacted you and was potentially a lead or a prospect. Then they showed enough interest that they became an actual customer. Now they have an account and they have contact information stored within your system. And they made a purchase, so now products are assigned to them. And maybe they had an issue with shipping, or they had an issue with one of the products and they called customer support, and now they have cases assigned to them where there's a support cases that are involved. You see all of that data combined on a customer to get an overall view of how that customer is interacting with your business. IoT then adds another layer on top of that that allows you to get down to the product level to see exactly what the product is doing for that customer and how it's helping them or how it's performing. So how these two pieces tie together when we start talking about CRM and the Internet of Things, how these work together, this scale can get much larger than you're seeing here on your screen, but it all breaks down into 5 steps. There's something that your customer has that somehow gets put into that CRM system. So that could be through a direct link, through a purchase order, or someone putting it in to the system after an order's been placed. That could happen through a registration system. That could be through a remote connection if you've got equipment that connects to the internet already. During that registration process, if it's turning on and firing up and saying hello world, it could be also connecting and putting its information in your CRM. So that data then gets captured and stored in your CRM against that customer, so you know exactly who that product belongs to. Then as that product's getting used, whether this be an end consumer product, whether it's a business product like a vehicle or a capital equipment, or whether it's something in a manufacturing facility or in healthcare, something on that product, there's a sensor that gets triggered. And that sensor then sends information. So that could be a sensor that's just continuously sending data if you look at an analytical standpoint, or one that only reacts based off of an alert that's happening, something that's going to be failing. That message is then processed and sent up to a cloud storage. Now you can do a direct process into both Salesforce and Dynamics where you skip some sort of cloud processing. However, in that scenario, you'd be looking more at an alert system, more of a reactive system, where you would only be sending information once there's a failure. So if something stops working, if something goes beyond the point of too much pressure, too much heat, low oil, any of those type of scenarios, low temperature, high temperature, those type of processes could be sent directly into a CRM system. But if we start looking at trending, where we're going to be sending multiple messages a second, or even one every second, where we want to know the status of a machine or the status of a sensor to see where it sits, that's where we need to get more into a cloud storage solution that can handle millions of transactions. Now, both Salesforce and Dynamics have these. Microsoft has the Azure IoT suite, and Salesforce has the IoT cloud, and both of them are designed to be scalable to handle millions of transactions per customer. When we look at a CRM system, they're designed to handle millions of transactions over the course of a year for a customer. Well, there's a possibility with multiple products throughout the world for a single company, you might be handling millions of transactions in a single day. And there has to be a different system that can handle that type of load. So if you get into trending and analytic reporting from an IoT standpoint, you really have to start to look at a different solution than just your core CRM, but both platforms offer options for that. So if you're going to use one of those platforms, if you get into that scenario, once that goes into a cloud for processing, whether that be the Azure IoT suite or the IoT cloud for Salesforce, a process then starts to shuffle through that and determine, all right, is this something that just needs to be logged because I'm just trending it, or is this outside the normal realm of allowed scope and I need to send this information off? So if that gets in that scenario where, you know, it's monitoring, say, a temperature sensor, and it's monitoring temperatures, and the temperature is always consistent, and suddenly over the course of time, maybe over an hour, it starts to trickle up a little, up, and it starts to spike. And it gets past a certain threshold that's set within one of those cloud systems. At that point, it immediately kicks a message off into the CRM system and starts to alert the appropriate channel. And in that case, potentially a service department or customer service, so they can get in front of the issue and contact the customer and let them know they're seeing an anomaly and it looks like there's something that's going on and something needs to happen with that. So that's a customer service scenario. It doesn't have to be that. It can be any type of process can then turn around and notify someone in service or notify marketing or even other partners. If you've got a dealer or distributor network, the system could be set up to alert specific dealers or distributors for that area. If your product goes out to a territory that has another business and there's a distributor that maintains that relationship. Any of those scenarios are possible when we're talking about the Internet of Things. So this model can get much more complex than what we've just described, but in its most basic form, there are these, at minimum, these core steps that need to happen when we start talking about how do we get from a sensor up to an actionable item. So I hope you've enjoyed this session as we started talking about the Internet of Things and started to get the wheels turning and thinking about how that's possible within your business, what products you might have that you could use for the Internet of Things with sensors or with data. And I just want to reiterate that if you haven't started thinking about it, now is the time. When we start looking back, you know, the term Internet of Things was coined back in 1999. The transition of the Internet of Things when things started to overtake the internet in data happened in 2008. So just know that if you haven't started thinking about how the Internet of Things can benefit you, there's a good chance your competition has. And understand that IoT is a reality. It's happening right now. And if you're not in front of it, you're going to end up behind it. So before we get through with the session, I want to leave you with one final quote. This from Ayn Rand. She was a Russian-American novelist, philosopher, playwright, and screenwriter back in the 1920s. And what she had said back then, this quote, was as true then as it is at this very moment when we discuss IoT. And that is, you can avoid reality, but you cannot avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. Thank you for taking your time today to join us for the session.